So first of all, let me do the thing for the video. I saw Thich Nhat Hanh do this many times at his retreat, and he always says, "Today is August 9th, 2017, at the Christine Center, and this talk that I'm giving today is called The Eight Consciousnesses and the Ultimate Dimension." And lo and behold, that's the title on this sheet. So I'm going to be referring to this at times throughout the talk. So let's just take a second to kind of look through the pages. On the first page with all the circles and the big Z on there, I tried to reproduce that up here. And you can see my circles are not quite what Thich Nhat Hanh's are. They're not quite as perfect, but I did the best I can. That gives me something to work on for the future. So these are the 8 consciousnesses, and Paul Broadwin alluded to these a little bit on his talk, and today we'll be going into those in detail. And then the big blue Z on your sheet is also up there, so we'll talk about that a little bit more too. Just as a kind of a hint of what's to come, we're going to be talking about the 8 consciousnesses, and then we're going to be talking about the ultimate dimension. So the ultimate dimension and the historical dimension are what we're going to be talking about. U stands for ultimate, H stands for historical, and up on the top of the Z you have an H, and on the bottom you have a U. I didn't put those in the handout. You can put those in if you would like, but that's kind of what we're going to be covering. If you go to the next page, that is the Eightfold Path that we've been talking about, and I will talk about today. Those of you that saw the video on Monday night know that we talked about the first 6, and then tonight's video is going to be Thich Nhat Hanh talking about the last 2, which is right livelihood and right diligence. The next page is definitions. So some of this stuff is going to be maybe a little bit difficult to understand, so I put some whole page of definitions in here. Most of these we'll go over. Some of these were in my original talk, but I had to cut them out because I just don't have time to cover everything today. But anyway, I think these definitions will help you out. And the last page, where it says the 18 realms of phenomena, is really what we're going to start our talk with today. So, and I must say that I'm more of a writer than I am a speaker. So I actually write all my Dharma talks out word for word, and so I will mainly be reading those to you. And the good news about that is that this is always already in its final form on my computer, so if anyone would like a copy emailed to them, I can shoot it right off to you. So, let's begin with the 8 consciousnesses and the ultimate dimension. I also have titled it In the Path of Non-Fear. So, good morning, dear Sangha. Before we start today's Dharma talk, let me recount one of my favorite sayings from the Buddha. He says, "My teachers are like a finger pointing at the moon. Do not get caught in thinking the finger is the moon. It is because of the finger that you can see the moon." Our discussion today will consist of many concepts and notions. They are wonderful teachings that can lead us on the path of understanding, compassion, and joy. The trick for some of us will be to not get caught in these words. The finger can be a very interesting thing to look at. If I look at my finger, I see a couple of knuckles, a fingernail. Oh, and there's a scar I attained in a very unskillful manner last year. If I concentrate just on all the little details on my finger, then I can forget that it was ever even pointing at a moon. I hope that by the end of this talk you will have some understanding of both the finger and the moon. So today we will be talking about the 8 consciousnesses. Some of you may be familiar with these if you have read the Thich Nhat Hanh book, Understanding Our Mind, which is on sale at the bookstore here if you're really interested. The information I will be relating to you will be from that book and what I learned on retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh. In the summer of 2014, I had the great good fortune to be able to attend a 3-week retreat at Thich Nhat Hanh's main monastery, Plum Village, in the south of France. The title of the retreat was What Happens When We Are Alive and What Happens When We Die. Before I left, I did a very wise thing. I obtained copies of all of Thay's Dharma talks on DVD. We saw one Monday night, and we will see another tonight. By the way, if you attend the mindfulness community in Milwaukee, there's a set of all these DVDs in the library that you can check out. I have since watched them on several occasions, most recently when preparing for this talk. As it turned out, it was to be Thich Nhat Hanh's final major teaching before he suffered a stroke. He is still alive and living in Plum Village, but at the age of 90, almost 91, it is unlikely he will recover his speech or ability to walk. In my view, it seemed that he was preparing us for his absence. The teaching seemed to be a culmination of his life's work. They came from the Yogacara school and the manifest only or mind consciousness only schools of Buddhism. These developed out of the Mahayana Abhidharma in the 5th century. In this school, there are 8 consciousnesses. So we can look at our board here. They are in numerical order: the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind consciousness, manas, or mind, and stored consciousness. One of the things that originally attracted me to Buddhism was the fact that it recognized the 6th sense beyond what we usually accept in the West, the mind. We will work our way through these 8 consciousnesses during the course of this talk. So let us begin with the first 5 consciousnesses. These will be very familiar to us. In the Western world, we call these our 5 senses: the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body. So we can look at our handout on the last page where it says the 18 realms of phenomena. This may seem intimidating, but it really isn't. It's very simple. So we can see there are 3 columns for our table. They are biological formations, physical formations, and mental formations. These should all make intuitive sense to us. We perceive the world with our 5 senses. We have been trained since birth to experience our world in this way. The beauty of a summer sunset, the soaring sounds of a symphony, the smell of baking chocolate chip cookies, the taste of those cookies, yum, and the touch from a warm hug. As we see that sunset with our biological eyes, we look at the form of the sun. Our eye consciousness then feeds into the 6th sense organ, the mind. The mind notes the physical formation of the phenomenal world, in this case the sun. The eye consciousness then feeds directly into the mind consciousness. This is shown in our first diagram, or up here, where we have these 5 senses connecting directly into the mind consciousness. So this simple table and the accompanying diagram make this portion of our teaching very simple. The ear hears the sound of the symphony, which creates the mental formation, which is fed directly into the mind consciousness, which interprets the new information. So we have now explained the first 5 consciousnesses and touched a little on the 6th. Well, that wasn't so bad. We got through 5 out of 8 already. This could be a short Dharma talk, but it won't be. So during the course of this discussion, I will say the word consciousness many times, and I'm going to get tired of it. So sometimes I will just abbreviate consciousness and say C. So I might say store consciousness, store C. So now let's skip ahead to the 8th consciousness at the top of your diagram, which is store C. Store C is what we've been hearing so much about this week. The store is the totality of everything that is. It contains all phenomenons, including what we can experience with our first 5 C's, and all those things we cannot. It contains the cosmos, a dandelion, this Dharma hall, all of you wonderful people. It even includes my neighbor's bulldog puppy, Eddie. He's really cute, and I think he has a sense of humor. It holds the mind and mind consciousness. Story consciousness holds everything in the historic and ultimate dimensions. It contains the teachings of birth and death, and also the teachings of no birth and no death. More on these later. The main function of store is to preserve all our seeds. Seeds, in this sense, are considered our mental formations. In this branch of Buddhism, as Paul mentioned the other day, there are 51 mental formations. Thich Nhat Hanh calls these seeds of potentiality. These seeds can help us to transform more fully into our Buddha nature. These are what we judge to be both wholesome and unwholesome mental formations. Among the good formations are kindness, compassion, joy, happiness, and mindfulness. Now, in his second mindfulness training, we talked about the 5 last night, for those of you who attended. In the second mindfulness training, called True Happiness, Thich Nhat Hanh says, I can live happily in the present moment simply by remembering that I already have more than enough conditions to be happy. What he's talking about is these good seeds that are contained in our stored consciousness. I sometimes hear people say that maybe people in very dire straits, such as prisoners or people living in the slums of India, probably don't have these conditions. This is incorrect. Everyone has these seeds in their stored consciousness, just as everyone has Buddha nature. There are also bad formations such as anger, fear, jealousy, pride, and selfishness. Thich Nhat Hanh teaches about selectively watering these seeds. If one of these seeds arises to our mind consciousness, the first step is to become aware of it. If we are angry, we know we are angry. If we water the seeds of anger, then they will become stronger in both our store and mind consciousness. If we water our seed of anger, it may even become a habit energy. We are exercising our anger. But we look deeply and try to understand the source of that anger inside of us. When we are angry at someone who is in front of us, we also have the opportunity to try and bring forth to our consciousness an opposite seed that is more positive. In the case of anger, the opposite seed is compassion. If we look deeply at the person that is making us angry, we can see that he suffers. We can begin to train ourselves to feel compassion for her. As our compassion grows and becomes stronger, our seed of anger recedes. Our anger is always there, ready to manifest under the right conditions. But now we are growing our seed of compassion to help us be a happier and more helpful person. Thich Nhat Hanh, in his commentary on the Sutra on Knowing the Better Way to Catch a Snake, gives us the following words. Even the blocks of pain, sorrow, and despair hidden in the depths of our consciousness are impermanent. If we know how to practice, we can bring about deep self-transformation. We have learned that there are 2 ways to transform our pain. The first way is to invite it up and look deeply into its nature. The second way is to water the seeds of the opposite nature and know that they will bring about transformation at the base of our consciousness. So how do we work with our seeds? We find the answer in the Buddha's Eightfold Path, right diligence or right effort. Some people think that right diligence simply means that we should try harder. If I only meditated more, for longer periods, went to Sangha more often, or read more books, things would get better. According to the Buddha and Thich Nhat Hanh, this is not correct. What it really means is we should be diligent about the seeds that we are watering, or bringing up into our mind consciousness. We should put our effort into bringing up positive and wholesome seeds in ourselves and in others. We want to water those seeds that lead us to positive action or karma in the world. If we are experiencing anger and despair, can we recognize we are caught by our negative seeds and perhaps try to bring out positive seeds? This not only makes the world a better place, but it also makes us happier. This is a much kinder and gentler approach to right diligence. We don't have to push ourselves to attain knowledge. In fact, that may put us even further behind. We simply need to take good care of the seeds we are watering. If we practice right diligence, right mindfulness, right concentration, we are well on our way to right view. Right view is the insight of understanding and compassion. If we practice with right diligence and water our positive seeds, every day our Buddha nature continues to grow. Tonight we will be seeing a DVD from Thai on right diligence. As part of my practice, I visit prisons as a Buddhist chaplain. I go to Wapan and the Racine Correctional Institution. A few weeks ago I was in prison talking with an inmate. He was very angry about his experience with attempting to get paroled. His original sentence had been for 12 years, and now he had been in for 22. He was 25 when he entered the system, and is now 47. He has tried to do everything he is told to further his chance for parole, or at least a change to a medium security prison. Anger, frustration, and despair are overwhelming him. He is a seasoned practitioner, and he has had periods of peace and contentment in confinement. I could see the pain in his eyes. How could I not feel great compassion for this man whom I respect and I consider a brother? I suggested some possible Buddhist practices he could consider. He knew them all and rejected them all. He had completely given his consciousness over to his negative seeds and continued to water them every minute of every day. I then thought of Thich Nhat Hanh's quote about trying to water the seeds of the opposite nature to the ones we are experiencing. I suggested he try to find a seed of kindness and compassion in himself. He looked at me as if I was crazy. And I said, well, maybe not for other people right now, but for yourself. He still looked at me as though he thought I was nuts. But as we parted for the day, he looked back at me and said, thanks for coming. And I could tell he meant it sincerely. So I said, take care of yourself, as no one else will, as he walked down the hall and back to his cell. It can be a great leap for us to become aware of the negative seeds that are controlling our life. The positive seeds of meditation can help us with our awareness. The process of transforming those negative seeds by bringing up the opposite positive seeds can be very difficult. But again, with right diligence, we can do it. This 2,600-year-old path of watering seeds from our store consciousness is now being backed by recent scientific studies. They have discovered that neuron pathways in our brains are plastic, and they have the ability to change, as we saw with Paul's video last night. We may have a very deep neuron pathway called anger. The more we exercise our anger, the deeper that groove gets. This then becomes a strong habit energy that may cause us to suffer and to spread our suffering to others. On the other hand, we may have the intention to make our pathway of compassion deeper. This neuron pathway might be very shallow, but as we water the seed of compassion, the neuron pathway will become deeper. In contrast, because we are not watering the seed of anger, that pathway will begin to fill in. The pathway of compassion can then be deeper than the pathway of anger. If before my habit energy was to respond with anger, now I can respond with compassion. This then becomes what I call my default response to life, compassion. Thich Nhat Hanh says, thus we train ourselves. So let's now turn to our sixth consciousness, the mind, which is also called manas. If we look at our diagram once again, we can see that manas arises out of the stored consciousness. One of the Dharma talks I heard Thich Nhat Hanh give was titled, Self-Clinging Manas, Where Our Problems Begin. Sounds rather ominous, doesn't it? The base of manas is our life force, our will to live, our drive to survive. The main function of manas is to cling to life and defend itself from all dangers. Tai says, the nature of manas is delusion, ignorance, and discrimination. Not very good characteristics, I wouldn't say. Sure. The nature of manas is delusion, ignorance, and discrimination. Manas is where we develop our sense of self. We take things from our store consciousness to create our identity. Thich Nhat Hanh says, manas attaches to the store consciousness like a small child who clings to her mother's skirt. The main role of manas is to create I am. For me, I am this body. I am the son of an abusive father that did the best he could. I am a recovering alcoholic. I am a pretty good photographer. I am an engineering specialist. I am a Buddhist. I am engaged to a wonderful woman, and I am ordained in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. These things are my heavily constructed self that I believe are me with all my heart. Manas has created my identity. This is my self. Manas has many characteristics that we may not always find helpful. Manas is always seeking pleasure. For me right now, that pleasure would be food that I know I shouldn't eat. On occasion, I give into the pleasure of a burger with cheese, bacon, barbecue sauce, and onion strings. On a bun with a side of fries. Manas also ignores any consequences. I know that a few hours later I will feel very sluggish and have a feeling of heaviness in my stomach. Manas doesn't care. It already had its burger. Manas also wants to avoid pain at all costs. I still try to avoid conflict or potential arguments whenever I can. I have a fear of being bullied by people, even in situations at work when I'm simply reciting policies that I know will back me up. It's manas that drives my fear to avoid these situations, sometimes to my detriment. Manas also ignores the law of moderation. Manas is gluttonous and greedy. It doesn't believe in the middle way. And it ignores the goodness of suffering. For the lotus to bloom, it must begin in the mud. Manas does a wonderful job of providing the mud for our lotus. Sometimes maybe too much mud. The trick is to keep our mud at a manageable level while transforming it into compassion and understanding. And Thich Nhat Hanh on his video holds his hand up this far and says, your mud shouldn't go any further than this. So. Manas is where our five aggregates or skandhas reside. We may be familiar with these from studying the Heart Sutra. They are form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. Thich Nhat Hanh states, this is also where our habit energies, delusions, and craving come together and create a tremendous source of energy that conditions our actions, speech, and thinking from the Eightfold Path. This energy is called manas. The function of manas is grasping. The mode of perception for manas is always false perception, he concludes. This is where our wrong perceptions of manas and its view of self is the cause of so much suffering. This is where our problems reside. This is the view of the historical dimension. Tai says, to say manas is always discriminating means that it holds on to the object it regards as itself, its beloved. Everything in the world is connected to us. Yet we think, those things are not myself, only this is myself. The veil of ignorance that covers manas is the tendency to discriminate between self and non-self. There is a possibility of transformation from clinging and discriminating to letting go and non-discrimination. then the discrimination between self and non-self, mine and not mine, will vanish. As we will discuss later, discrimination is in the historical dimension and non-discrimination is in the ultimate dimension. So where can we turn for help? Thank goodness there's one more consciousness. This is the seventh consciousness, or the mind consciousness. If we again look at our diagram, we can see that Manas is the base for mind consciousness. Tai says the highest task of mind consciousness is to shine the light of mindfulness on Manas and the seeds in our store consciousness, allowing us to see them. When our mind see projects light on these seeds in our store see, touching them deeply with mindfulness, it penetrates the blocks of delusion and helps them be transformed. When illuminated by the light of mindfulness, delusions are less able to manifest in unwholesome acts of our body, speech, and mind. When the blocks of ignorance are transformed, Manas is transformed. So Mind See has the ability to help Manas out. It can pay appropriate attention and discover what causes suffering and happiness. It can see the good things about suffering. Suffering leads to understanding and compassion, which leads to love and happiness. Mind consciousness can practice the 5 mindfulness trainings, which we discussed last night. These are trainings of morality so that we are not carried away by Manas. These trainings shine the light on Manas. These trainings are awareness. They help us become aware that we can create less suffering for ourselves and others by practicing them. The seed of mindfulness from our store consciousness can help us become aware of the wonders of the world, which can bring us joy and happiness. Mindfulness can also stop dispersion and help us stay in the here and the now. We can enjoy the wonders of the present moment, which can be nourishing and healing. Mindfulness can help us create joy at any time, simply by being aware that we already have enough conditions to be happy. Those are the good seeds of our store consciousness. Another way Mind See can help Manas is through deep listening and loving speech. This also helps reduce suffering. The final aspect of Mind See is the capacity to develop the wisdom of non-discrimination and connecting with the ultimate dimension. Tai says, the way to train our mind consciousness in correct perception is through mindfulness. This is the most important contribution of the mind consciousness. When we are mindful, when we are aware of all our actions of body, speech, and mind, we can choose to act, speak, and think in wholesome ways rather than in harmful ways. With the energy of mindfulness generated by our mind consciousness, we can avoid watering seeds of anger, craving, and delusion in our store consciousness. And we can water seeds of joy, peace, and wisdom. This is why it is so important to train our mind consciousness in the habit of mindfulness. End quote. Yes, we can create new positive habit energies. We can train ourselves to be more mindful. We can train ourselves to perceive the ultimate dimension. Thich Nhat Hanh continues, because the mode of perception of Manas is always erroneous, much of what we perceive in our mind consciousness is also false. Because the nature of Manas is obscured, our mind consciousness is also covered in delusion. End quote. So, are we trapped in our wrong perceptions in this historical realm? No. And this is the key to helping us understand the ultimate dimension. Thich Nhat Hanh continues, unlike Manas, our mind consciousness is capable of other modes of perception as well. It is able to perceive things directly and is capable of touching the realm of suchness, the realm of the ultimate dimension. Again, mind consciousness comes to the rescue. It can perceive the phenomenal or historical dimension we live in day to day, but it can also take us to the ultimate dimension, which is spiritual. When we look again at our diagram, we see that Mind See has another circle intersecting it, And we've called that one the wisdom of non-discrimination. As we follow this new path, we will look at another pointing finger. This will take us to a new line of concepts and notions. The roots of these two views of reality go back to an Indian monk and philosopher named Nagarjuna. He lived in the 2nd century in the Common Era. He developed the two-truth theory of reality. He labeled these truths conventional and absolute truth. Through the history of the last 18 centuries, the ideas have traveled through the Mahayana and Zen schools. Our teacher Thich Nhat Hanh has defined conventional truth as the historical or phenomenal dimension of reality, and the absolute truth to be the ultimate dimension of reality. This is a deep teaching focused on the difference between what we experience in our known phenomenal world and what can be known through meditation and insight about the true nature of the ultimate world. The focus of the rest of our discussion will be on how we perceive our world on a day-to-day basis, living in the historical dimension, and how it is possible to perceive our world when learning to see the ultimate dimension. So take heart, we're halfway through. So let's begin by answering a simple question. Since I already live in the historical dimension, why should I care about the true nature or ultimate dimension? It's a good question. Now let's take a moment to talk about what we can achieve and when we apply the practice of Buddhism in the historic dimension. I know that many people who practice Buddhism, myself included, believe that the goal of our practice is simple. We sit and look deeply in an effort to transform our own suffering so that we can practice kindness and compassion for all living things. The teachings required to do this are what Thich Nhat Hanh and others are most known for. There are many great teachers available to us. The two that speak most clearly to me are Thich Nhat Hanh, a Zen master, and Sharon Salzberg, an insight meditation teacher from the Theravada tradition. There are also wonderful books like Tara Brach's Radical Acceptance and James Baraz's Awakening Joy that can assist us in our transformation. In addition, there are local Dharma teachers that we can see at retreats, such as Stephen Spiro and David Haskins in Madison, and Jack Lawler from Evanston. And of course, we get to enjoy our very own Paul Broadwin and Paul Norton. There are many Buddhist teachers available to us that can help us to recognize, own, and work through our own suffering. Many of us have already have a stable practice schedule. Some of us may have been attracted to the practice by the turning of the wheel. Maybe we have found that the Four Noble Truths ring true for us. The first noble truth is the simple recognition that suffering exists. This can be a huge relief for us to simply have our suffering acknowledged. We can easily develop wrong perceptions that tell us others are better off than we are in a myriad number of ways. But we now know that we are not uniquely bad people because we don't feel good about ourselves or about our lives. Everyone has suffering in their lives. The second noble truth is that there is a cause of our suffering. We may have had issues with anger, fear, or self-esteem. When we have looked deeply at these issues, we may clearly see the cause of these issues. This leads us to the third noble truth, which is that there can be a cessation of this suffering. A couple of years ago, I led a class that helped people look at the feelings of unworthiness and helped them along the path to self-acceptance, liking themselves, loving others, and the big one for me, learning to accept love from others because we are worthy to receive it. This was a path I had traveled, and so I was able to present my path to others to show them how they may alleviate their own suffering. We may also have begun the fourth noble truth, which is that there is a way out of suffering, namely following the Eightfold Path. Using right mindfulness can help us to have right view and then to touch the other six spokes of the wheel. Using the ground of the Four Noble Truths, we can come to terms with ourselves and begin to transform our negative habit energies. We can then retrain our focus from looking inside and concentrating our energy on our own healing. we can now begin to look outside of ourselves, and we now have the chance to connect with the world at a deeper level than we had previously known. In this way, we can be available to show kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy to all living beings. When we can do this with equanimity, we are practicing the 4 Brahma Viharas, or heavenly abodes. This is a very wonderful way to live. This leads us to the practice of engaged Buddhism, which Thich Nhat Hanh is so known for. I like to define engaged Buddhism as compassion in action. The mindfulness community of Milwaukee has a very active practice in this way. We have people like myself that lead Sangha, that develop classes, and teach in the Sangha setting. We have people that engage in prison Dharma at the Waupun, Dodge County, and Racine County correctional facilities. We have people that work with Dry Hooch, an outreach program for veterans who are having problems. We have people that will go into the MPS school system to teach meditation to teenagers. That would be too much for me. I don't think I could do that. We have people that lead days of mindfulness for children and their parents. We have people that work with the dying in a hospice center setting. We have people that work with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. We have people that provide meals with the guest house, the homeless shelter for men. We are a very active community. These are some of the ways we can bring our practice off of the cushion and out into the world. Clearly, there are many wonderful things that our practice of applied and engaged Buddhism can help us with in our daily lives. Our goal then as a Buddhist community is to practice loving kindness and compassion for all beings. By following the principles I just described, we can live a very contented, fulfilling life and be of great service to others. We can do much good in the phenomenal world, and yet all these things occur in the historical dimension. Isn't this enough? Why should we care about the ultimate dimension? The answer is yes, it can be enough. Until I went to Tai's 21-day retreat, it was enough for me. I am happy with my transformation that I have seen in myself since I began to practice. I am a much more contented and happy person. I feel I can relate with people better than I have at any other point in my life. And I have known peace. And yet we know there's more to Buddhism. We know there's a deeper teaching at another level of reality. We know there's also the true nature realm, or the ultimate dimension. We may have heard about it in one of our readings. But how can this deeper learning help us in our daily lives? How can I begin to understand and access this realm? Is it worth the effort? Why is it so confusing? These are all questions I have asked myself. I will try to answer some of these questions in the remainder of this Dharma talk. When we begin to connect with the ultimate dimension, we find that there is an increased depth in ourselves and in the world that we can begin to access. I have mentioned the word suffering many times in this Dharma talk. I do so because to me it is the ground of Buddhism. But there is much happiness and joy that we can also attain in this life. Thich Nhat Hanh says the happiness comes directly out of suffering. No mud, no lotus, as my shirt says. In the ultimate dimension, we can begin to cultivate that depth in ourselves. So now that we have begun to contrast and compare the historical and ultimate dimension, let's see if we can begin to understand these ideas a little more deeply. Let's think of these two dimensions as circles. Most people live in the circle of historical dimension and never consider there might be something else. There's nothing wrong with this, and we have seen with our discussion of applied Buddhism that many people can live wonderful, happy, compassionate lives in this way. Of course, Buddhism doesn't hold a patent on this kind of life. You can find your way to that place with any religion, and there are some people that just seem to be born with the ability to live in this way. But there are also many people that do think there must be more than the historical dimension of this phenomenal world. They know that in addition to our historical circle, there must be another circle for the ultimate dimension. These are the spiritual seekers, like those of us in this room. This is a very important realization. We now have our two circles, and we can think about how they relate to each other. We know that we have lived our whole lives aware of our existence in the phenomenal world. We have been trained since birth to live in this world. But now we are getting a glimpse of the ultimate dimension. How do we begin to reconcile these views of reality? How do we begin to bring our circles closer together? Can we get our circles to touch? Can we get our circles to overlap even a little bit and actually feel the inside of the ultimate dimension? Can we even become like a Zen monk where the circles almost completely overlap and they live simultaneously in the historic and the ultimate dimension? So let's return to our diagram. We see our two circles of mind consciousness and the wisdom of non-discrimination. These are the circles we want to overlap. The idea of duality is also the idea of discrimination. This is the historical dimension. This resides in the mind consciousness. The idea of non-duality is the idea of wisdom of non-discrimination. This is the ultimate dimension. It also resides in the mind consciousness. Our task is to get this wisdom of non-discrimination circle to envelope more of our mind consciousness. So in our diagram, we have them just barely touching. If we were Thich Nhat Hanh, it would be completely overlapped. As my spiritual path has been proceeding in my search of meaning in this Buddhist tradition, I had come to a place of frustration. I could not understand the concept of no self. I had spent a year trying to figure out what that meant. It made absolutely no sense to me. How can there not be a self? I'm right here in this body now. I am myself. Manas tells me so. How can I not have a self? I was once on a trip to India that was led by a Dharma teacher from the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition. The tour was called In the Footsteps of the Buddha. Our first stop, appropriately enough, was Sarnath, which is the home of the original deer park. This is where the Buddha gave his first teaching after his enlightenment. He gave it to his 5 former ascetic companions. The topic was the 4 Noble Truths, including the Eightfold Path. This was called the turning of the Dharma wheel. The next morning, our guide took us to a Tibetan Buddhist temple down the road from Deer Park. It was a stunningly beautiful place with all the bright, vibrant colors we usually associate with that faith. There were even a couple of very young monks in robes that were playing around with a set of Hot Wheels in a fountain. So, very cute. We were there for what seemed to be a very long time, and our guide was being rather secretive. He spent a lot of time on his cell phone and talking to the resident monks of the monastery. At last, he revealed why we had been waiting so long. The 17th Karmapa was in residence and giving audiences. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the hierarchy of the Tibetan Buddhism, there's a Dalai Lama and there's a Karmapa. They're pretty much equal. As we waited, our guide was giving us a constant update on our position in queue. Finally, we were next. Security was very tight. We were searched by 2 men before we were allowed to enter the building. We were then led up into the 3rd floor and searched again while we waited for the group in front of us to finish. I was filled with anticipation. I thought, this is great! Now I can ask a revered Tibetan Lama what no self means. How can it get any better than this? So I asked him. Unfortunately, the poor man wasn't feeling well. He had met many people that morning, and he was so tired his eyes were watering. I did ask my question. He looked at me and mumbled something like I should try to meditate on that topic more. He then said he was very tired and he had to get some rest. End of audience. I was very disappointed. As time went on, I began to understand more about Thich Nhat Hanh's core teaching of inner being. This is the idea that all things are related. My human body cannot exist without help from things that are not me. I need oxygen, food, sunshine, shelter, warmth, water, and a host of other things. The Buddha said, this is because that is. When one understands this, we can see that there is no separate self. Nothing can live without help from many other things. Therefore, there is no self. This is a teaching we can understand with our intellect. It really only makes sense. This is touching the ultimate dimension of reality. But there is also plainly a self. I am this body. I am me. I am me. I am not you. I have a personality that I call me. It is composed of my life's experiences. I've also been affected by my ancestors and the collective consciousness of the society I live in, as Paul mentioned yesterday. This me is formed by the 5 aggregates or skandhas. I mentioned these earlier as being the invention of manas. Forms, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. Myself includes my desires, cravings, ignorance, and habit energies. It also includes all my positive and negative seeds we have talked about in our description of the store consciousness. This perception of our separate self is what we see when we look at the eyes of our historical dimension. So, is there a self? Yes. Is there a non-self? Yes. Can we be aware of both simultaneously? Yes again. This is not an either or proposition. Both things are true when seen from 2 different planes of reality, the historical and ultimate dimensions. So let's now turn to sign and the teaching of signlessness. In Buddhism, when we talk about sign, we are talking about the form or appearance of a certain object. In the historic dimension, we know by looking at it that a desk is a desk, a cup is a cup, a chair is a chair, and a piece of paper is a piece of paper. But is it? Let's look at this piece of paper. You're probably thinking, Dave, I have seen thousands of pieces of paper in my life. Why are you having me look at this one? Well, when we look at the sign or appearance, we do see that this is simply a piece of paper. But this is just its current form. When we look at this with the eyes of the ultimate dimension, we try to see all the forms that this piece of paper has been or ever will be. We know that this piece of paper came to us after being processed at a paper mill. There was a logger involved that cut down the tree that got it to the paper mill. There was the original tree. There was the original seed that made that tree. There was the parent tree of that tree, and so on and so forth, back into how many hundreds of years ago. Now, what will happen to this piece of paper in the future? Well, I'll recycle it. Maybe someday it'll come back to me and I'll write Dharma notes on it again. Maybe it'll be burned and the ashes will go down into the soil and help to provide nutrients for the next tree. Maybe the smoke will go up and help to create a cloud. And maybe that cloud will rain over the next tree. So you can see that with the eyes of signlessness, we're not caught just on this one form of this paper. We try to see all forms that it will ever be. So let's think about this in another way too. Another way we can look at signlessness and not get caught in the one present vision of form is by looking at a picture of ourselves as a small girl or boy. When we truly see this child and remember her happiness and joy, his laughter and tears, her fear and disappointment, and his excitement and delusionment, we can see ourselves as we were at that time. Now we can look in the mirror at a recent photograph and see what? All those same emotions that I just described with the perspective and perhaps wisdom of an adult. Now when we look at the form of ourselves as these 2 different times in our lives, what do we see? Am I the same or a different person at these 2 ages? When we look deeply, we find that we are not the same, but we are not different. Has that 5-year-old boy died? Of course not. He is still alive inside of us and has helped make us the person we are at this present moment. His sign or his form has changed, but that does not mean that he no longer exists. In the same way, when we see ourselves today, does that mean we will always be this way? Of course not. The concept of impermanence tells us that all things change at every moment. Our sign or form will continue to change even after this body dies, and conditions are no longer sufficient for the body to manifest. Now, let's begin to look at duality and non-duality. These ideas can be explained by defining our historical and ultimate dimension. Dualism exists in the historical dimension. Birth and death, sameness and otherness, coming and going, being and non-being. It's clear all these things exist for us. This body has been born and will die. I'm not the same as you, which makes you other than me. My body is changing, impermanent, and is coming and going. And now I am, but after I die, I will no longer be. This is called the thinking of discrimination. But in the ultimate dimension, we can see these things differently. We can now begin to look with the eyes of signlessness and not get caught in form. Now we can begin to cultivate the wisdom of non-discrimination. This tells us that there is no birth and no death. There is no sameness and no otherness. There is no coming and going. And there is no being and non-being. This is non-duality. This will lead us to right view on the Eightfold Path. Now let's spend some time talking about the Eightfold Path and see how this can help us out. We can start with right mindfulness meditation, which when paired with right concentration leads to insight or right view. Right view here means to be able to see the ultimate dimension. Right view then becomes the ground for right thinking, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. We need to remember that the historical and ultimate perceptions of reality are not oppositional. One is not better than the other. They both simply are. As Thich Nhat Hanh would say, they inter-are. They inter-be. They are one. Our goal is to be aware of both of these simultaneously as we enjoy the world in the present moment. So now, let's turn our attention to what happens when we are alive and what happens when we die. Thich Nhat Hanh likes to use the metaphor of the wave and the water. He says, in the historical dimension, observing a wave, we can talk about the birth and the death of the wave. The wave as being high or low, more or less beautiful, this wave compared to that wave, and so on. When looking at it from the ultimate dimension, water, all those adjectives, all those ideas that you use to describe the wave are no longer valid. There is no birth. There is no death, no this, no that, no high, no low, no more beautiful or less beautiful. The wave does not have to die to become water. The wave is already the water in this very moment. Tai continues, we have a historical dimension which we live every day, but we also have an ultimate dimension, which we try to live using our spiritual practice. If we can live in the ultimate dimension at the same time as we function in the historical, we will have no more fear. When there is no more fear, there is true happiness. A wave has a right to live her life as a wave, but she must also learn to live her life as water, because she is not only a wave, she is also water. And water lives without the fear carried by the wave, he concludes. The wave is the water. I've heard Tai say, it doesn't matter to me if I'm the wave that is this human body or some other wave. Thich Nhat Hanh says we should try and see our continuation body now while we are still alive. Our continuation comes from our karma, a type of energy that cannot be destroyed. Our continuation comes from right thinking, right speech, and right acting. If a cloud is acid, its rain will be acid. After the disintegration of our human body, you cannot say that you no longer are there. You are continued by your thinking, speech, and action. You are continued by all the people you have affected with your actions. Kaya is continued by the fourfold Sangha. Monks, nuns, lay women, lay men. All of these will carry forth his teachings after his body is gone. His work in engaged Buddhism will also carry on. Tai says, when you conceive your continuation body, staying in this human body really doesn't mean much. He then says, I am the nature of water. I cannot die. Buddhists say there is no birth and no death in the ultimate dimension. But what does science say? The first law of thermodynamics states that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. You can transfer matter and energy into other forms, but you cannot create it or destroy it. It can only be transformed. Science has found that the true nature of matter and energy is no birth and no death. So if matter and energy's true nature is no birth and death, then we are also of the nature of that matter and energy. This agrees with Buddhism when it says there is no birth and no death, only transformation. Science and Buddhism come together. So, way back a long time ago, when this Dharma talk started, I used the example of the finger pointing at the moon. So let's return to that. When we look at our diagram, we can see that as we go up from the five consciousnesses, through mind consciousness and manas and on to store consciousness, we are in the historical dimension. That's what this H means. At the bottom of the page, your page, we have a blue Z, which I have reproduced up there. Thich Nhat Hanh used this to talk about the historical and ultimate dimensions and the role of meditation to reconcile the two. When we look at the top line on our Z, we are in the historical dimension. I got a little H up there. The historical dimension is the home of duality, the home of opposites. Birth and death, being and non-being, coming and going, sameness and otherness. These are the finger pointing to the moon. We can spend our whole lives looking at and working on this finger. Our diagram also moves horizontally to the orange circle on your diagram, the wisdom of non-discrimination. Here we can find the ultimate dimension. Our Z on the bottom line is also what Thich Nhat Hanh would refer to as the ultimate dimension. This is the dimension of non-duality. There is no birth, no death, no being and non-being, no coming and going, and no sameness and otherness. The ultimate dimension is the moon. Our Z diagram tells us that to get from the top of the Z, the historical dimension, to the bottom, the ultimate dimension, we must use the seat of mindfulness meditation. And that comes out of our store consciousness. This allows us to achieve right mindfulness, right concentration, and right view, which leads to the insight of the ultimate dimension. This is the moon we are pointing to. This is not to say that being on the path of the finger, the historical dimension, is bad. It is only a reminder that that path continues and that we can reach the moon and the ultimate dimension. The greatest gift Buddhism can bestow on us is the gift of non-fear. Non-fear of death. This can be attained in the ultimate dimension. Thich Nhat Hanh says, once you no longer fear death, there is only enjoyment. Thich Nhat Hanh says, this is the teaching. So So thank you all for hanging out through that. I think the escape rate was only about 3% or so that's not too bad. So, how long do we have, Paul, before...